One of the perks of my job is that I get to travel a lot. I've been lucky enough to visit some incredible places, like Greece and Italy, but most of my work trips are still within the US. A few years ago, I was sent to this mountainous region in the northeastern United States called the Adirondacks. If you've ever been there in the fall, you know exactly what I mean when I say it's breathtaking. The leaves change colors and the mountains look straight out of a fairy tale. It's honestly unreal. Usually, my job covers a hotel, but this time I really needed some quiet time to myself, so instead I booked a secluded cabin through Airbnb. The place I found was perfect, tucked away in the trees, with a stunning view from the back deck overlooking part of the mountain. There were even trails nearby where I could go jogging in the mornings. For privacy reasons, I won't mention the name of the woman who owned the property. My work commitments were only in the late afternoon and early evening, so I had most of the day to myself. I arrived Friday night, had a couple of drinks out on the deck, and went to bed early. The next morning, around 6 a.m., I went for a jog on the trails around the house. And the entire time, I couldn't shake this horrible feeling that I was being watched. You know that feeling? That heavy, uneasy sensation in your chest, like someone's eyes are on you? I had it the entire run. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just anxiety from being alone in the wilderness. I mean, I'm a city girl. I'm not exactly used to being out in the middle of nowhere. After the jog, I showered and spent a few hours just relaxing around the house. But I kept hearing strange noises. Little things. Creaks, shifts, sounds I couldn't explain. Again, I told myself it was normal. Old wooden cabin, mountains, wildlife. It had to be that. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, I left for town to meet my coworkers. We handled our work, then grabbed drinks afterward. And even though I didn't say it out loud, I really didn't want to go back to the house. Something about it just didn't feel right. Still, I tried to ignore that feeling. I even suggested having a small after-party at the cabin just so I wouldn't have to be there alone, but everyone turned in early. So eventually, I drove back. The whole ride, I kept trying to calm myself down, repeating the same thing over and over. It's just a house, houses make noise, you're safe. I got back around 11:45 p.m. and honestly felt relieved at how tired I was. I figured I'd fall asleep quickly. Before going to bed, I checked every single lock, 3 times. Then I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept drifting off for a few minutes, then waking up suddenly, convinced I heard something outside. I tried playing music on my phone to drown it out, but it didn't help. If anything, it just kept me more awake. Eventually, a little after midnight, I gave up. I decided to go downstairs, step out onto the deck, and smoke a cigarette while I thought about just leaving early. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and my cigarettes and headed downstairs. The stairs led into the living room, and to the left was the kitchen and dining area. At the back, there was a sliding door that opened to the deck, where I was heading. But the second I stepped into that dark room, I froze. Something felt off. There was this shadow in the kitchen, blocking part of the moonlight coming through the window. My stomach dropped. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just shadows, just my imagination. So I reached for the light switch, and when the lights came on, I saw him. A man. Standing in the kitchen, clear as day. He was tall, around 6 feet, with long, messy hair and a thick beard, maybe late 30s. We just stood there, staring at each other. It couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. He was slightly hunched over, just watching me. Then, suddenly, he lunged. I don't even think he meant to fully sprint, more like a quick, aggressive move towards me. But there was a kitchen island between us, and that small delay gave me just enough time to turn and run. I sprinted upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. Looking back, I know that's the kind of thing people scream at characters for doing in horror movies, but in that moment, it felt like my only option. I didn't think I could make it to the front or back door without him catching me. And even if I did, I didn't have my keys, and I had no idea if he had a weapon. Running blindly into the woods in the middle of the night didn't feel any safer. So I locked the door, ran into the closet, and called 911. I gave them the address and begged them to hurry. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me. And then he started pounding on the door, violently. Each hit shook the wood, and between the strikes, he kept saying the strangest things. He kept telling me he loved me, that he'd changed, that he needed me back. But I knew without a doubt I had never seen this man in my life before. I started yelling back, telling him he had the wrong person, that I didn't know him, but it was like he couldn't even hear me. He just kept going. The door started to crack. I could actually see his fist breaking through the wood. That's when I heard sirens. I've never felt relief like that in my life. Police cars pulled in just as he forced his hand through the door. There was a loud crash and shouting. At the same time, I climbed out the bedroom window onto a small section of roof, trying to get as far away as possible. The noise I heard was the police tackling him just as he was about to break in. An officer saw me on the roof and helped me down. They arrested him while he kept screaming incoherently. Later, they contacted the homeowner, and that's when everything made sense. That man was her ex-fiancé. Apparently, after a bad breakup, he disappeared for a while. But the worst part? He had been living inside the house, in one of the closets, for days. They found beer cans and snack wrappers in there. I still don't understand why he didn't come out sooner, and honestly, I don't want to know. Because if I hadn't gone downstairs at that exact moment, things could have ended very differently. The officers also told me he had taken a knife from the kitchen and tucked it into his waistband, which means I probably caught him in the act. The homeowner was horrified, and last I heard, he was going to jail. But what still scares me the most is I checked the locks 3 times, and it didn't matter, because he was already inside. Sometimes you really don't know how dangerous a place can be, and as strange as it sounds, that cigarette might have saved my life.
Okay, this one is just weird. At the time, it definitely freaked me out, but afterward, I kept wondering if I was overreacting. This happened about 2 years ago when I traveled out of state for a job interview. It was roughly a 5-hour drive. Instead of driving all the way back home the same day, my fiancé suggested I just stay overnight somewhere nearby. I'm terrible with apps and booking things like that, so she actually found an Airbnb for me, somewhere about 10 minutes away from where my interview was. The place looked nice, so I booked it. The owner of the house seemed really friendly. We messaged back and forth, and when I told him I was in town for an interview, he even offered to let me check in early so I could get ready there instead of rushing straight from a 5-hour drive. I thought that was really kind. He sent me the code for the keypad lock and explained how everything worked. It was simple, just one button, but I appreciated the instructions since I'd never used one of those locks before. My interview was scheduled for 3 p.m., and when I checked the GPS, it said the location was only about 9 minutes away. I still gave myself extra time just in case. The interview went okay. I think it went well, but like always, I spent hours afterward replaying every answer in my head and second-guessing myself. Afterward, I grabbed some tacos and headed back to the house. That night was pretty uneventful. I ate, talked to my fiancé on the phone, and watched a movie. I've always found it a little uncomfortable sleeping in someone else's bed, even if it's clean, so I decided I'd just sleep on the couch and leave early in the morning. The living room was actually really cozy. There was this big wraparound couch in front of a fireplace with a huge TV mounted above it, and it even had surround sound. Honestly, I was perfectly happy just staying there all night. Around 11 p.m., I grabbed a blanket from one of the bedrooms and put on Avengers Endgame. I think I made it about 15 minutes in before I started drifting off. Then suddenly, the doorbell rang. At first, I just laid there, half asleep, wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe it was part of the movie. But then, it rang again. I checked my phone. 11:33 p.m. Who rings a doorbell that late? My first instinct was to ignore it. But then it rang again, and again. Each time, it made my heart jump. By the 4th ring, I decided I needed to check. I walked over cautiously and looked out the front window before opening the door. There was a man standing there. He was skinny, holding a small brown paper bag. His head was tilted down, and he looked off, almost unresponsive. I opened the main door but kept the screen door shut and locked. The porch light was dim, so I couldn't see his face clearly. Without looking up, he said in a flat voice that he had my pizza, except he clearly didn't. It was a small paper bag, not a pizza box. I told him politely that I didn't order anything and that he had the wrong address. Then I shut the door. I barely made it a few steps away before the doorbell rang again. This time, I went back more annoyed than scared. I opened the door, and before I could even say anything, he repeated the same line, "I have your pizza." I told him, more firmly this time, that I didn't order a pizza. And then he said my address out loud, said the delivery was for this house. I started raising my voice, telling him it was a mistake. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. He reached for the screen door handle. At that point, I snapped and slammed the door shut, telling him to leave or I'd call the police. Then I quietly moved back to the window and crouched down to watch him. He stood there for another minute, then walked away. He got into this beat-up red sedan. One of the headlights was broken. Once he drove off, I finally felt a little relief. Weirdly enough, after all that, I was actually hungry, so I went into the kitchen to grab something to eat. But as I was walking back into the living room, I noticed lights still shining through the windows. I looked outside, and my stomach dropped. He was still there, sitting in the driveway. The car was running, and one bright headlight was shining directly into the house. At that point, I went upstairs to get a better view from one of the bedroom windows. The light was so strong I couldn't see him clearly, but I could tell the car was still on. I had two thoughts: call the police or go outside and scare him off. And for some reason, I chose the second option. I threw on my shoes and marched outside, trying to act confident. But when I got to the car, it was empty. No one inside, and the engine was still running. That's when fear finally hit me. I turned and ran back inside as fast as I could, locking the door, and this time I even latched the chain at the top. None of it made sense. Why would he leave the car running? Where did he go? I grabbed my phone and went upstairs, trying to message the owner, but he didn't respond right away. I stood there for several minutes, staring out the window, debating whether I should call the police, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Then, I saw him. He came back into view and got into the car, and it looked like he was coming from the direction of the front door. That chilled me more than anything. He backed out of the driveway and finally drove off. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I stayed awake on the bedroom floor watching videos on my phone until morning. At 4 a.m., I gave up completely. I got ready, packed my things, and decided to leave. But as I walked toward the front door, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The door was unlocked, slightly open. The chain was still latched, which is why it hadn't fully opened, but the main lock was undone. I just stood there, trying to process it. I was sure I locked it, but I also didn't want to believe the alternative. Then I realized something worse. When I ran back inside earlier, I never locked the screen door. As the sun was rising, I rushed out to my car, and that's when I saw it. On the side of the porch, that same brown paper bag. I hadn't even noticed it before. For a second, I thought about opening it, but honestly, I didn't want to know what was inside. I just left. But before I got out of the neighborhood, I passed this rundown greenhouse at the end of the street, and in the driveway, there was a red car. Same color, same broken headlight. It looked exactly like the one from the night before. Later that morning, the Airbnb owner messaged me apologizing for missing my message and asking how my stay was. I told him everything: the delivery guy, the car, the unlocked door, the bag, the matching car down the street. I saw him typing, and then nothing. He never replied. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when I started telling people the story, they all had the same reaction. They thought it sounded like a setup. When I checked more recently, that house isn't even listed on Airbnb anymore. And now, I don't know what to think. Maybe it was all just a bizarre coincidence. Or maybe
I was a lot closer to something dangerous than I realized. Let me start by saying this. Monsters are real. They're not ghosts or demons. They're people.
Real people who can hurt you. My family still hasn't fully recovered from what happened to us last summer, and honestly, I don't think we ever will. I'll start from the beginning. My husband and I decided to take the kids on a small beach vacation. Nothing extravagant, just a few nights away by the ocean. When we were looking at places to stay, we realized that Airbnb rentals were actually cheaper than most of the hotels. I found this really nice house. It wasn't directly on the beach, but it was only about a 5-minute walk, and it was much more affordable. The best part was how private it felt. It was at the very end of a dead-end street, and behind the house was a creek and a line of trees. It felt peaceful, safe. We arrived in the afternoon and spent a few hours at the beach before heading to the house. My son is 8, my daughter is 13, and normally they argue all the time, but something about being there had them getting along perfectly, playing together, laughing. It was honestly one of the best moments of the whole trip. Looking back now, that was probably the highlight, because things started to change after that. We got to the house around 5 p.m., unpacked, and everyone got cleaned up. My kids picked their rooms, and I started preparing dinner. I had brought groceries with me because I love cooking, and it's just easier than going out every night. My husband and I have a simple deal. He handles the dishes, I do the cooking. That night felt normal. We ate, played Uno for a while, and eventually went to bed. I slept great. My son didn't. The next morning at breakfast, he looked exhausted. He barely touched his food. When I asked him what was wrong, he just sat there, quiet, almost embarrassed. After some gentle pushing, he finally told us. He said he saw ghosts. I know how that sounds, but he was completely serious. He told us he saw shadows moving in the backyard. He said they came out from the tree line near the creek, walked toward the house, disappeared for a bit, and then went back. And one of them turned and waved at him. He was in tears telling us this. Whatever he saw or thought he saw, it genuinely terrified him. We all tried to calm him down, told him ghosts aren't real, that it was probably just shadows or his imagination. Eventually, he started acting like himself again. We spent the day at the beach, and for a while, everything felt normal again. But when we got back to the house that evening, I noticed the front door wasn't locked. I asked my husband if he had locked it. He wasn't sure. He's not as strict about that stuff as I am. I checked the house, nothing seemed out of place, and since we hadn't left anything valuable behind, I tried not to worry too much. That night was similar to the first. Dinner, games, the kids went to bed around 10 p.m. My husband and I stayed up a little later, having a couple of drinks. Then, sometime close to midnight, there was a knock on our bedroom door. It was my son. He was shaking, barely able to speak. He said the ghosts were back. I immediately got up and checked every window. I didn't see anything. I kept asking him to show me, but he was too scared to even look outside. The only thing I noticed was that the backyard floodlight was on, but that could have been anything. Wind, an animal. Then he said something that made my heart sink. He told me one of the ghosts tapped on his window and spoke to him. It told him if he screamed, it would hurt our entire family. He said it told him it would leave him alone if he opened the door. Instead, he came to us. At that point, I wasn't scared of ghosts. I was scared because something was clearly terrifying my child. That night, he slept in our bed, and I barely slept at all, because I could feel him shaking beside me the entire night. The next morning was worse. He looked completely drained, barely ate anything. That's when I had an idea. I suggested we all sleep together in the living room that night, like a little campout. Build a fort, make it fun. The kids loved the idea, especially my son. I figured if something scared him again, at least we'd all be together. We stayed up playing games, laughing. Eventually, we all fell asleep. Then, around 2:30 in the morning, my son shook me awake and whispered, "They're back." I sat up expecting to see nothing, but I was wrong. At the sliding glass door, there were 3 figures wearing black hoodies, black masks, with these horrible, bulging white eyes. They looked unreal, like something out of a nightmare. I screamed. That woke up my husband and daughter too, and the moment they saw them, they started screaming too.
One of the figures moved toward the door and started trying to open it. Thank God it was locked. My daughter grabbed her phone and called 911. My husband grabbed a heavy walking stick we had inside and moved toward the door, shouting at them to leave us alone. But they didn't run. If anything, they looked like they were enjoying it, like they were feeding off our fear. Then one of them pulled out a knife and started waving it slowly. My kids were crying, screaming, and I will never forget those sounds for as long as I live. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. A police officer came rushing in and tackled one of them to the ground. The other two tried to run, but they didn't go far. The police caught all three of them. When they removed the masks, I was shocked. They were just normal-looking young men. Later, we found out two of them were 20, and one of them was only 18. My son thought they were ghosts because of the darkness and how they were dressed, but they weren't ghosts. They were something much worse. The police told us all three of them had knives, not just the one we saw. Apparently, there's a group in that area that targets tourists, especially families. They assume families have money and that having kids makes them easier targets. What scares me the most is that they kept coming back. They were watching us, waiting. The police said they probably didn't intend to physically harm us, but honestly, I don't believe that, because no one knows what would have happened if they got inside. And even if they didn't hurt us physically, what they did mentally, that damage is still there. We've all changed since that trip, and I can say this with complete certainty. We will never go back to that house, or that town, not ever again.